What do kidnapping, highway robbery, and shoes have in common? You're about to find out in this episode of Forgotten Felonies.
Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica.
And I'm Olivia.
And this is where we take you back in time to rediscover the tales of vintage villainy that time forgot. This is a special episode.
Yes, so I am a member of a Facebook group called Forgotten Oregon, and another group member posted a mugshot about one of his ancestors. So what did I do? I tagged Monica in it.
Naturally. And then I told the fellow, Don, that we have a historical crime podcast, and I would love to cover his story next. So Don is pretty excited about it, and I've already uncovered a lot of things that he didn't know, which makes all of it so worth it. So we're going to be dispelling some rumors, and we're going to share some very intriguing revelations that were lost to history. Now, with that being said, let's walk back in time to March 11th of 1920. On the morning of March 11th, Inspector Bob LaSalle was on his way to police headquarters. He lived in Multnomah and had to make his way to Portland like he did every morning. Driving down Terwilliger Boulevard near Slavin Road, he came upon a most unusual sight. There in front of him was an automobile flipped upside down. There was no one in sight, no bodies, no witnesses, no stranded motorists. What was there was incredibly puzzling. 48 pairs of shoes were scattered around in every direction. That's 96 individual shoes just strewn about Terwilliger Boulevard.
And knowing Terwilliger Boulevard, that is not something you see every day.
I'm sure it looked a little different in 1920, but I mean, that's bizarre, no matter where you are or what year it is.
Every time I go up there, I drive on Terwilliger.
Oh, so it was definitely puzzling. Inspector LaSalle was able to get the numbers off of this vehicle, and they found that it had been rented by a woman named Mrs. Mabel Lowry, who was 31 years old, and she was living at 421 and a half East Morrison Street. Inspectors LaSalle and Scopius were able to track down Mrs. Lowry, and it turns out that her daughter, 17-year-old Margaret Baker, had been with her in the car when they skidded out of control and flipped upside down on Terwilliger Boulevard. The women were promptly arrested, but the story they told was incredible, and it led the authorities to uncover a burglary and fencing operation that was at work in Portland. But this operation was mere child's play in the grand scheme of things. One of the men involved was actually part of a notorious gang that was very well known in Southern Oregon, the Jones Brothers Gang. And now we need to go back in time even further. My research into this all started with Ellsworth Kelley. Ellsworth is the man that we saw in the Facebook post, and initially this whole episode was going to be about him. I soon found, however, that Ellsworth was a small part of something much bigger, and that shifted the focus to a whole gang of thieves and robbers.
Eugene Ellsworth Kelley was born September 22nd, 1895 in Racine, Wisconsin. He was the second of three children born to William Harry Kelley and Estelle Bertha Ellsworth. By the 1910 census, the family had moved to Des Moines, Polk, Iowa, from Wisconsin. But around 1912, his parents moved to Grants Pass, Oregon. I'm unsure if Ellsworth moved with them at that time.
Yeah, the earliest mention of Ellsworth Kelley in any newspapers, anywhere on newspapers.com, was actually March 21st of 1915. Ellsworth and his partner in crime, Dewey Jones, were facing a judge for charges of larceny in a dwelling, and that means that they stole things from people's private homes. Dewey was 17 years old, so Judge Gillette was going to treat him as a juvenile. He sentenced Dewey to 6 months of Sunday school.
Church?
Yep. Apparently, Dewey just needed Jesus. He had to go to church every Sunday for the next 6 months. And for every Sunday that he missed in that 6-month period, he'd have to go to 2 to make up for it after the 6-month time period ended. And at the time that he's making up missed days, if he goes twice in one day, it will count as 2.
That's a really odd and confusing sentence.
I agree. I was shocked and amused, and I was very excited to put that in the episode. As for Ellsworth, he was 19 years old, and he was not treated nearly as easily. Ellsworth was sentenced to 1 to 7 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. It was April 12th of 1915 when Sheriff Smith of Grants Pass got Ellsworth Kelley on a train to head to Salem so that he could begin serving his time. Now, Ellsworth wasn't very excited about going to prison. I don't know anyone who would be. But when he got there, he seemed pleasant enough. I mean, he wasn't trouble, anything like that. Now, at the age of 19, he was a young prisoner. He had not committed a violent crime, and they assumed that he would be no trouble at all. Because of this, Ellsworth was one of 13 inmates who were leased to Clatsop County Court to operate a rock crusher.
Oh. There you go.
Yeah. So these 13 inmates, they were referred to as the Honor Road Gang, and they were sent to the Tongue Point rock crushing plant, and that's when Ellsworth Kelley escaped. It was May 10th, 1915, just shy of a month after going to prison. His freedom lasted for 3 days, and he was caught by the chief of police in Auburn, Washington. And of course, he was sent straight back to the Oregon State Penitentiary to continue serving his sentence. This time, they were going to keep a much closer eye on Ellsworth Kelley.
So at this time, World War I had been going on for almost a year. It began in July of 1914, and on May 18th of 1917, the United States instituted the World War I military draft by passing the Selective Service Act. It required 24 million men to register, which was about 23% of the total U.S. population at the time. From this pool of 24 million, just 2.8 million were actually drafted into the military. As citizens of the United States, men who were incarcerated were also legally required to register for the draft. On June 5th, 1917, all men aged 21 to 31 had to register. Ellsworth was 21 years old at the time. It was that very day, June 5th, 1917, that Ellsworth filled out his draft card, and I found it. We have a picture.
Yep, and we will share that. So about 6 weeks later, after he filled out the draft card, on July 23rd, the newspaper published a list of registered men in the order that they would be called for the draft. It was very interesting, and I don't fully understand all of it because, as we just said, only 2.8 million people of the 24 million who filled out the cards were even called. So I'm confused on that. But anyway, so Ellsworth on this list, he was number 1,543. Later on December 20th, they brought all of the incarcerated people from the list, so anyone on the list who was in prison, they brought them to see the draft board. And the newspaper published a list of them ranked in order from highest liability to lowest, meaning which people would be the most risky to let out of prison, for the draft. Ellsworth was number 241 in the pool of 392 men. Ellsworth had not committed a violent crime. He just committed a property crime. And I don't know if they even took his prison escape into account, shortly after he got there, but they ultimately decided that he'd make a fine soldier, and he was one of 29 men called to service from Marion County. So he got out of prison. It was the very beginning of May 1918 when they let him out, technically on parole, and sent him to Camp Lewis, located near Tacoma, Washington, which you guys probably would recognize as being called Fort Lewis, and I used to live there, actually. Anyway, 7 weeks after arriving at Camp Lewis, Ellsworth Kelley was arrested in Selma, Oregon, for desertion. I don't know when he left Camp Lewis. It didn't say in any of the articles when he had left, how long he had been gone. But he says that he had been asking them for a furlough to visit his family, and it had been denied, so he decided just to take matters into his own hands, and he left. And he also threw away his uniform. He was returned to Camp Lewis, where he was given a trial, by the military people, and he was sentenced to 15 days in the guardhouse. After 5 or 6 days of that sentence, they let him out. And about 2 weeks later, on July 18th, 1918, he deserted yet again. I don't know exactly where he went on July 18th, but by the very beginning of October, he was back at his sister's house in Selma. He talked to her and her husband, and they helped him decide that he should probably turn himself in. So his brother-in-law took him to Grants Pass on October 5th, 1918, where he was again arrested and then returned to Camp Lewis. He stated at that time that he is against killing people and he objects to going to war. And then it was about 9 weeks later when Ellsworth was discharged from the military, which was very lucky because one possible penalty for deserting for a second time is 20 years on McNeil Island.
So I had never heard of McNeil Island, but McNeil Island was home to a prison that was accessible only by air and sea. It was just west of Steilacoom. It had been a federal penitentiary for more than a century. In 1981, it was given to the Washington State of Corrections and became a state prison rather than federal. It closed altogether in 2011. This prison was the last one in the country that was only accessible by air and sea. While the prison has officially shut down, there is still a detention center on the island for violent sexual offenders.
And I think that is actually pretty cool. Because you always say things like, why don't you just put them on an island together or something? And they're actually on an island together. Anyway, so I would say Ellsworth Kelley got really lucky that he was just discharged and then released. And doing the math, removing the weeks that he was AWOL, he was only in the military for a total of 19 weeks. But it is less than that because I don't know how long he was gone the first time. So about 4.5 months, only at Camp Lewis, when he wasn't AWOL, and then he was out. So remember that, listeners. You're going to want to remember that for later in episode 2. And so Ellsworth Kelley was free. But 2 months later, on February 21st of 1919, so just 2 months after that, he was sentenced to 1 year in the Multnomah County Jail for having burglarized a store.
He really just has sticky fingers.
Yes, he does. And this is a good time to explain the difference between burglary and robbery. Burglary is technically a property crime. There's nobody home or nobody in the store, and the person breaks in and steals things and then leaves. So basically, it's being somewhere you're not supposed to be for the purpose of taking things that don't belong to you. Robbery, on the other hand, is a violent crime. Robbery is when you use force or the threat of force against a person so that you can take things. If someone breaks into a house and they think it's empty, and so they're trying to burglarize the place, but then they encounter that someone is at home, if they threaten them or even pretend to have a gun, it has then turned into a robbery. So from a property crime to a violent crime. Now, anyway, our boy Ellsworth, he was a burglar, just FYI. Now, let's turn our attention back to young Dewey Jones, who was sentenced to church in 1915.
Yes. Dewey Jones was born in Franklin, Arkansas on October 28, 1897. He was the fourth of 7 children born to George Washington Jones and Mary Loney Sims. The sibling right above him was Milam Jones. Milam was born November 1st, 1895 in Ozark, Franklin, Arkansas. According to the 1900 Oregon census, when the boys were 5 and 3, they and their family ended up moving to Grants Pass, Oregon. There, their brother, Bert Oregon Jones, was born on May 15th, 1901.
I wonder if that's why they named him Bert Oregon Jones. If that's why that was his middle name, because they had just moved to Oregon. And Oregon is clearly better than Arkansas, so maybe they were celebrating by naming their child after that. Sorry, any Arkansas listeners, I didn't mean it. Okay, 17-year-old Dewey Jones was lucky to simply face a sentence of 6 months in church after he and Ellsworth Kelley had burglarized some homes. Dewey would have finished up that sentence around September 21st, unless he missed some Sundays, and I don't know if he missed any. I don't see any mention of him getting in trouble again soon after, but 3 months after Dewey's church sentence was over, his little brother, Bert Oregon Jones, age 14, got into some very big trouble. Oregon Jones, as he was called, along with an 18-year-old young man by the name of Silas McClung, had paired up to burglarize the Bunch Brothers warehouse in early December of 1915, and they got away with quite a haul. They had cut some fastenings and broke locks on several trunks and suitcases that were stored there. They got an automatic shotgun, a rifle, a suit of clothes, an Eastman Kodak, a pair of hip boots, several suits of underclothes, a set of novelty knives, and more. So the boots were found in the possession of another Grants Pass man who said that he'd bought them from a lad by the name of Oregon Jones. They found the automatic shotgun in the possession of Silas McClung, as well as the suit of clothes. Among Oregon Jones's things, they found another small Kodak that had been stolen from a different warehouse a few months prior. So now they're seeing there's probably a pattern of this behavior. Oregon Jones, being just 14, was sentenced to reform school. He had to do at least 1 year, but he could stay until he was 21 if his behavior there was not great. Silas McClung was sentenced to prison, but he was turned over directly to a parole officer in Salem, so I'm not sure how that worked. It was the state parole officer, that's what they called him. So the two of them began serving their sentences in early 1916. According to later reports, Oregon Jones was actually released from the Oregon State Training School in 1916 as well, so he clearly didn't even serve a full year. And then in 1917, he was convicted of robbery way over in Oklahoma, along with his brother Dewey Jones, and they both received 2-year sentences in Oklahoma. Yeah. Dewey and Oregon Jones had an older brother named Milam Jones. I wasn't able to find much about Milam in the papers. However, in 1924, the authorities said that Milam had been the leader of the Jones Brothers gang that operated in Jackson and Josephine counties in southern Oregon. So these three brothers, they were involved in highway robbery and burglary for a number of years. 30-year-old Milam was eventually arrested in Los Angeles in 1924, and then he was extradited back to Josephine County, Oregon on March 28th of 1924. He then escaped from the jail on April 23rd, and it was a very violent jailbreak, and the only reason nobody died is because the pistol that he'd gotten his hands on was defective and wouldn't go off. They never ever found Milam Jones. To this day, 102 years later, they still have no idea where he went. He had escaped with a Mexican man named Jesus Gomez, and I do believe Jesus was caught, but Milam was gone with the wind. 30-year-old Milam left behind his co-conspirator and girlfriend, 35-year-old Ruth Brown, and their 6-month-old daughter, Virginia June. Ruth and the baby were incarcerated together in the Josephine County Jail.
It's common sense to have comfortable and vigorous feet. You can combine foot health and style when you wear the Arch Preserver shoe. Its concealed built-in arch bridge and flat inner sole prevent sagging and pinching. Come and see this differently better shoe in the newest styles. The Arch Preserver shoe keeps the foot well. Price Shoe Co., 326 State Street.
All right, switching gears a little. Where we left off in the timeline for Ellsworth Kelley was when he was sentenced to 1 year in Multnomah County for burglarizing a store. That sentence began on February 21st of 1919, and roughly 13 months later, that car was found overturned, surrounded by 96 scattered shoes. So here's what happened. It was Wednesday, March 10th, 1920. Ellsworth had been recently released from Multnomah County Jail, and he had remained in the Portland area. That day, 2 women needed to get to Gresham to visit a family member who was ill. They rented an automobile from Smith Auto Company, and they began their trip. When they reached East 21st and Division, they were accosted by 2 armed men. The men got into the automobile, and they forced the woman, Mabel Lowry, to drive them to Hillsboro, straight to the CC store.
The old papers mention CC stores often. It was basically a generic term, like when we say grocery store, but in this case, CC stands for cash and carry. It was very normal to run a tab or credit at different stores, so a CC store was simply a store where people had to pay for their item before they took it home.
Yep, and now that's
Which-
basically how stores are.
Yeah.
But yeah, back then it was like, just put it on my tab. So, yeah. The armed men were Ellsworth Kelley and his companion, Harry Red Gardner. They somehow compelled the women to watch this burglary unfold. I don't know if the women were forced to go inside with them or if they sat in the car, but they stayed. Ellsworth and Harry took 48 pairs of shoes, 23 suits, and many pairs of men's dress socks. They stuffed it all in the rented car and they told the women to drive them back to Portland. For whatever reason, while they were driving down Terwilliger Boulevard near Slavin Road, the car began to skid and then it flipped over. And apparently no one was hurt, which is almost unbelievable. And everyone just left the scene. They left the car, they left the shoes, probably left the other stuff, but I don't know. And the women parted ways with the burglars.
And did they call the police?
Nope. But when Inspector LaSalle came upon this very bizarre scene on the morning of Thursday, March 11th, and then tracked down Mabel and her daughter Margaret, the women were promptly arrested. They told the police what had happened, and the police ultimately decided not to charge them with any crimes. However, they were both to remain in jail to be held as witnesses. Somehow the police figured Ellsworth Kelley was their man. I mean, he had just left jail a month or so earlier, so they were very familiar, and they had Ellsworth in custody by noon that same day. At noon on the next day, Friday the 12th, Lieutenant Maloney walked into a pool room in Vancouver. He and Harry recognized each other instantly, and before Harry had a chance to run, Maloney had him covered with his revolver. He got him handcuffed, and he took him to the station. Harry Gardner was told that Ellsworth had, quote, kicked through with a full confession, and this made Harry much more forthcoming. While being interrogated by Captain Circle and Lieutenant Maloney, he admitted to his part in everything. And I don't mean just the burglary of the CC store in Hillsborough. Harry said that he was, quote, in on all the jobs they had against Kelley. That afternoon, both Ellsworth and Harry were charged with larceny. That same day, a lot of inspectors went through all of the loot that they had found in the possession of these two men. In addition to what they stole from the CC store, they also found property reported stolen from the home of W. Commons on March 3rd, the home of D. Dom on March 5th, and the home of M.G. Maddox around the same time. They also found 2 watches, one made of solid gold, and neither of these watches had been reported missing by anyone, so they weren't sure where these came from. Overall, Ellsworth was implicated in about 15 recent burglaries in which several thousands of dollars worth of goods were stolen. They identified at least 11 burglaries in private residences, as well as that CC store and the Morton jewelry store. It also turned out that this was a burglary fencing ring, and 4 owners of pawn shops were actually in on it. Ellsworth and Harry would steal the items for the owners of the pawn shops. It was quite the racket.
Interesting. In criminal slang, a fence is a person who knowingly buys and resells stolen goods. Instead of trying to sell stolen property themselves, thieves would often unload jewelry, clothing, watches, or other valuables to fences for quick cash. And also, when they say thousands of dollars worth of items, that is a lot more than what it seems like today. Ellsworth stole $800 worth of jewelry from the Morton jewelry store in the year 1920, which would be equal to about $13,320.80 today in 2026.
Yeah, and I just want to take a moment to say how crazy it is that we are talking about something that happened 106 years ago. It's kind of cool. Anyway.
I mean, we do that quite frequently.
I know, but do you ever think about it like, dang, that was a long time ago. Okay, so 3 of the shops involved were owned by Alec Goldstein, his brother Harry Goldstein, and then Alec Goldstein's brother-in-law, Nathan Carl. After Ellsworth's arrest, he helped the police locate as much of the loot as possible. They even wound up arresting another pawnbroker, W. Jacobson, because they found 2 violins hidden behind some shelving. They had been stolen from John S. Anidson and pawned to Jacobson by Ellsworth Kelley. William Jacobson was actually Alec Goldstein's father-in-law, so all 4 of these shady pawnbrokers were related to each other by marriage.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Keep it in the family.
Exactly. By March 13th, 2 days after the arrest of Ellsworth, they had recovered about $5,000 worth of loot, and the majority of it was in those 4 shops. Now, here's an interesting side note. Mrs. Lowry, who was driving that rented car, she told the police that her mother had died when she was 5, and then she herself had been married off when she was 12. Then her own daughter, the 17-year-old who was also in the car, got married at 14 and has a child. Mrs. Lowry told the police that she was sorry for the role that she played, and she knows that she was making bad choices and she'll make better choices from that point on. She said she realizes she had done wrong and just wants to get back to her husband.
So was she part of it or not?
I don't know. It's confusing. Maybe because she didn't alert the police, Because, they probably would have expected her right afterwards when you guys parted ways. Why didn't you call us? But they may have threatened, to hurt him or something. I don't know.
Or maybe she was in on it the whole time.
Yeah. Or maybe she was like, ooh, you're going to rob a store. Can I come? It was like, I don't know. It confused me. Ellsworth and Harry were only charged for the burglaries of the Peel and Anidson residences, the CC store in Hillsborough, and the Morton jewelry store. Ultimately, on June 24th, 1920, 24-year-old Ellsworth Kelley and 25-year-old Harry Gardner pleaded guilty to a charge of simple larceny. This was part of a plea deal, and they were both sentenced to 1 year in the county jail with 3 months credit for time served.
It's a choice. They should have just not done time served.
Yeah, giving him the 3 months credit. That's what they do today too.
I know, but it's dumb if they did the crime, do the time.
Right, but they've been sitting there for 3 months. So? But yeah, I see what you're saying.
You reap what you sow.
Yeah. All right. So the judge said that they had done the state a really big favor helping to bring down those 4 merchants. And so, that's true. So that was cool. But anyway, 1 month after the sentencing, Harry Gardner and 2 others escaped. They had been working at the Kelly Butte rock pile, and they were able to tunnel under the wall of a shed and past the fence that surrounded the rock crusher. So that's July 24th. The other 2 were caught very quickly, but Harry Gardner was on the run for 3.5 months, and they finally caught him for a burglary the following November. So back at it. Now, I believe it was March of 1921 when Ellsworth Kelley was released from the Multnomah County Jail, and he returned to Grants Pass. This is where his parents lived, his siblings lived, but so did the Jones brothers. It would seem as though Ellsworth stayed on the straight and narrow path for the rest of 1921 because I didn't find any articles, but I doubt it. I think he just didn't get caught for things. By the summer and fall of 1922, Ellsworth Kelley and the Jones Brothers gang were united, and they were up to no good. Initially, Ellsworth was arrested for receiving stolen goods on December 10th of 1922, but he wound up being implicated in a number of unsolved highway robberies as well as home burglaries from the preceding months. By the time Ellsworth was arrested on December 10th, the Jones brothers had been in jail for a little while already. Oregon and Dewey Jones were arrested on Saturday, November 18th, and they were arraigned on November 22nd. 2 days later, Oregon Jones's wife, Audra Lee Jones, had a warrant out for her arrest. She was going to be charged with receiving stolen goods because the police, when they searched the house after they had caught Oregon Jones, they happened to see a whole lot of ivory toiletries in her home, which they thought nothing of. But it turns out that these were stolen during a highway robbery from a Mrs. H. Radcliffe just 2 months prior. Now, these highway robberies were terrifying. There were a lot of them beginning in August when Oregon Jones and, quote, another man had returned to Oregon from Sacramento. Now, I'm not going to tell you about all of these robberies because they are far too numerous, but let me tell you about the Greens Creek holdup that took place south of Grants Pass on September 5th of 1922. Oregon Jones and this other man, had driven past Greens Creek, and they saw a car camped there with some people sitting around a campfire. It was 9:00 p.m. when they passed by in Oregon's Mitchell automobile. He drove the car to Grants Pass, and then he and the other guy walked back to that camp. And it was 1:00 a.m. when they got there. At the campsite were 3 men, 2 women, and 1 little boy. They held them up at gunpoint. They got $35 off of them. They got a couple watches, lunch, a man's heavy woolen shirt, things like that. Now, the man who they took the shirt from, he kept looking at the robbers. They had white masks on their faces, but they didn't want to take chances. So Oregon told the guy, every time you look at me, I'm going to take another article of your clothing off of you. So, yeah, and it was cold and rainy, and clearly no one wants to be without a jacket, right? So then they took a look at the car that the people had. It was a new Maxwell. And I don't know what that looks like, but apparently it was fancy. And they saw that this car had a full tank of gas. So Oregon Jones and his partner made the 6 of these people pile into the back seat. And then he and his partner drove them to the top of Sexton Mountain, about 14 miles north of Grants Pass. So imagine this, Olivia. Imagine this from the perspective of the victims. Like,
I'm imagining.
How terrifying would that be? I mean, then they pile you in the car and drive you miles away because he took them from 4 miles south of Grants Pass, 14 miles north. So they went 18 miles away.
Well, if there's already 6 of them, or is there only 4 victims?
No, there's 6.
Then why didn't they just overpower?
They probably didn't have their guns or didn't have them handy, or I don't know. But yeah, Oregon and his partner were both armed. So there they are. They take him to Sexton Mountain, and they saw another car coming south because they're driving north. So they see this car coming south at 2:30 in the morning. So this car was owned by Mr. H.H. Radcliffe, who stopped and asked them, how much more bad road is there before I'm going to get back to good road, on the highway? And Oregon Jones was just, talking to him, small talk, about the roads and stuff. And while that was happening, his partner went around on the other side of the car. So now they're both on either side of the car. And then Oregon shone a light on them very brightly, and he told them to hold their hands up. In the car were 1 man, his wife, and a small boy. So off of the Radcliffes, they got $80, a man's watch, a woman's watch, 1 or 2 diamond rings, and 3 suitcases of clothing. Now they had 3 more captives. They had 9, a total of 9 captives at this point. So he had all 9 of the people in the back seat of Radcliffe's Studebaker. And he covered them with a blanket, and then he drove the car to a spot 7 miles north of Grants Pass. So they went back down south because they had been 14 miles north. So now they're 7 miles north of Grants Pass, and he kicked all 9 people out. Get out of the car. He kicked them out. He gave them some clothes. He gave them some blankets. He gave them some matches. And then Oregon Jones made a very helpful suggestion. He said, maybe a couple of you menfolk could walk back up the mountain, walk back up there to Sexton Mountain, which was 7 miles away, and get the Maxwell car that we left up there. And then you guys can drive back down to pick up, the women and the children and stuff. So he told Mr. Radcliffe that he would leave his car, the Studebaker, at the point where he had held up the Maxwell car. And then Oregon Jones and his partner drove toward Grants Pass when they met another car that was traveling north. So they were going about 40 miles per hour, and Oregon turned the car around and passed them, and then he turned his car across the road sideways to block their way. So in this car was 1 man, 1 woman, and a little boy. They got $40 and 2 diamond rings, and then all of this stuff that he had gotten that night and other nights, he pawned down in Sacramento using the name Frank Burgerman.
Burglar, burger.
Oh, yeah? That's close. So Oregon Jones's brother Dewey was later caught in possession of Mr. Radcliffe's watch.
With all the men they had, I think they could have overpowered them.
I don't know who the other man was. Actually, I do, but I'll tell you later. But Oregon Jones was 5'7", 155 pounds, and was not like a super big guy.
Yeah.
But, yeah. So anyway, I don't know what kind of gun he had. It could have been really big and intimidating. So that was on September 5th. And that was not the first of the highway robberies, nor was it the last. They said they were happening on average every other day, starting in August up until they got arrested in November. And it was mostly tourists who were driving through. Like the Radcliffes lived in California and they were, just driving through. So it was a crazy time over there in Grants Pass. Finally, the Jones brothers, Oregon and Dewey, were arrested and charged. And it was through talking to them that the police caught wind that Ellsworth Kelley was also involved, and that the Jones brothers were also part of the burglaries, like the home burglaries that were happening all over Grants Pass at the time. By Monday, December 10th, all three of them are in jail: Oregon, Dewey, and Ellsworth. And we know that Ellsworth really doesn't like to be locked up. He had already escaped once when he was on that Honor Road gang. So it's December 12th, 2 days after Ellsworth was arrested. Right now, okay, 1922. And Ellsworth and Oregon Jones violently attacked jailer William Schroeder after luring him into their cell. So they had a basket of food in their cell, and they were saying like, hey, could you give the rest of this food to the guys in that cell? And he was like, sure. So he opened the door and went in. And as he bent down to pick up this basket, they just attacked him. Now, they were able to get 2 revolvers and the keys. They went and opened the other cells, but the other prisoners, including Dewey Jones, refused to have any part in it. They locked jailer Schroeder in the cell that they had just vacated, and then when they left the building, Ellsworth and Oregon, they locked the front door and the outside door from the outside. So jailer Schroeder, he's beat up pretty bad and he's locked in a cage. He asked the other inmates whose cells were no longer locked to please get out. Like, please, leave this building, go notify the sheriff. Now, because those front doors were locked from the outside, the inmates actually had to remove the hinges from the door to get out. So Dewey Jones and his cellmate, John Pike, went together to the home of Sheriff George Lewis to tell him what had happened. And I think it's interesting that Dewey didn't run away.
It's also very trustworthy.
Yeah, but what else could Schroeder do other than just, I guess, wait till morning till someone showed up? But then that gives Ellsworth and Oregon like a huge head start,
Mm-hmm.
So a search for the escapees immediately began. Descriptions were given to other police departments. Oregon Jones was 21 years old, 5'7", 155 pounds, dark brown hair, blue eyes, medium complexion, has the letter J tattooed on his left forearm, and he wears a number 7 shoe. Now, as they ran, they robbed people that they encountered. $5 was taken from H. Lichty on 8th Avenue West, and a 2-bit piece was taken from the pockets of Roger Hall, who was robbed at 6th and Jefferson. They gave back that coin, though, and they told Roger that they were, quote, after bigger potatoes.
Standards.
Yeah, they're like, it's not worth it. Here you go. Now, 4 days after the escape, Mrs. Oregon Jones, so his wife, Audra, she broke down under intense interrogation. And they said they were giving her the 3rd degree, which meant that they were really going hard on her. So she breaks down. She gave them a ton of info about the holdups, and she even drew them a map to show where the loot was cached. It was like buried under an old tree west of the city. So they go out there. They found a lot of ivory toiletry articles. They found silk clothing there as well. But the jewelry and the money were taken elsewhere. Jewelry was pawned and stuff down in Sacramento. Now, the fugitives, they're still on the run. And so a $500 reward was promised to anyone who could capture the fugitives and bring them back to Oregon if they were out of state. So it's January 3rd, 1923, when they were finally caught in Evanston, Wyoming.
They went a pretty long way.
They did. This story is really good. It's really epic. So when they first escaped, they took, quote, the Blind to Medford.
So the Blind, and I'm learning this with you, everyone. The blind was railroad slang in the early 1900s. There were hidden spaces between rail cars where people could secretly slip in and remain unseen. When Oregon said they took the blind, it meant they illegally hitched a ride on a freight train.
Yep. And from there, they went up on the mountain where they stole a car, which they used to drive themselves to Roseville. They stole another car there in Roseville and drove to Sacramento. And then from there, they stole another car and made their way to Evanston, Wyoming. And that just seems like a strange route to take to get to Wyoming. But I guess if you're trying to lose people, then I don't know.
Well, they also didn't have the interstate.
True. But I mean, they went south to California and then they went over to Wyoming.
The Applegate Trail.
Right. Maybe they were on the Applegate Trail. Okay. Ellsworth was the first to be apprehended in Evanston. They had gone out of town, apparently. Like, it wasn't really clear on all of this. It just, he said, when I got back into town. So he walked back into Evanston, and they found that it was covered in a few feet of snow. Ellsworth was very cold, and so he went into the train depot to get warm. And the sheriff just so happened to be in the depot for the purpose of watching for the two escaped convicts from Southern Oregon, just in case they showed up. So the sheriff sees Ellsworth Kelley, and at first he's not positive that this is the guy, so he's watching him. And then Ellsworth gave him what he called, quote, the convict look. And so that cemented it in his mind. This was indeed one of the escapees. Ellsworth knew he was caught, so he made a dash for the door. He stuck a gun in the stomach of the deputy there, and then he ran off. He had several hundred feet of a head start, and he was running through the town. But now there were at least 12 men chasing him. He sees a house. He's like, I'm going to duck into this house, run out the back door, and I'll, get away. So he tries to duck into a house. But when he gets inside, he finds, not only is the whole family at home, but there is no back door. There's no back door in this house. So the family is freaking out, of course, because who is this guy? And eventually he found a side door that he could go out of. But by the time he located that door, the house was surrounded. So he gave up and he was taken to the jail in Evanston. Now, Oregon Jones, when he realized, hey, Ellsworth didn't come back, I wonder where he is, he went to the jail to look through the windows and everything, hoping to see if Ellsworth had indeed been arrested. Because if he had, Oregon was going to try to get him out. But he was seen by an officer and he was arrested. And so the two fugitives were caught. They were taken back to Oregon by the Evanston officers, at which time the Evanston officers were given the $500 reward money. And so, Oregon Jones and Ellsworth Kelley got back to Oregon just in time because they had a court date on Wednesday, January 10th of 1923. Ellsworth entered a plea of guilty to the charge of aiding and abetting a prisoner to escape from the county jail, and for this he was sentenced to 20 years. They dropped the charges for all the burglaries and the robberies, and they just let him take the heat for the jailbreak. He even led the officers to a spot on the north side of the railroad track near the reservoir where he had buried a bunch of loot that he had stolen from Mrs. J.M. Tetherow. So they knew very well they could convict him for burglary because he took them to the evidence, but they chose not to. And I think this is something that gets confused in contemporary retellings of this story because Ellsworth was sentenced to prison for aiding and abetting in a jailbreak, and that was it. That is why he wound up in prison, period. Now, Oregon and Dewey Jones had both put in pleas of not guilty of the charges of highway robbery. Dewey had gotten married in 1920, and they had welcomed a son in 1921. He told the police he was basically too busy to be out robbing people on the highway with his brother. He said he was at home with his wife and child on the specific 3 nights that were in question, but he did have that watch that had been stolen from Mr. Radcliffe. Now, Oregon Jones also said Dewey wasn't there. He would just refer to, quote, the other man or, quote, my partner, but he wouldn't even give a description. They were like, describe this man for us then. If it wasn't Dewey, just describe him. What did he look like? And he couldn't do it. So this is all looking very, very suspicious. Now, the trial against Dewey Jones began on Monday, January 15th. And apparently, he had told Oregon Jones that it wasn't going very well. So Oregon Jones did something very drastic. Oregon changed his plea to guilty, and he made a complete confession, of course, without identifying his accomplice. He did this so that he could testify in Dewey's trial. The confession made claim to nearly every robbery that had taken place in the summer and fall of 1922. And despite Oregon's efforts, Dewey was found guilty on Thursday, January 18th, 1923, and it took the jury just under 2 hours to reach a verdict. Sentencing took place the next day. Oregon was given 20 years for the highway robberies, and Dewey was given 25. So the judge took into consideration that Dewey was older than Oregon, and he pointed out that Dewey should have pointed out a proper path for his little brother, who was only 21.
But it's not on him to control his brother.
I know, but yeah, the judge is like, well, you get an extra 5 years because...
It feels like the judge is like, you went to church. You should have been reformed.
Right? Yeah. You should have told your brother he needed Jesus too. Come on. Yeah. So they left for the Oregon State Penitentiary on the number 16 train at 8:40 p.m. that night. And because of the recent jailbreak, the Josephine officers who accompanied them had them in irons and guarded them with sawed-off shotguns all the way into the prison office. And this was the first time that that had happened in the previous 20 years. Now, Olivia and listeners, here's the thing. You need to hear this. I mentioned earlier that their older brother, Milam Jones, was in the county jail in 1924. And then he escaped and he was never heard from again, right? Well, the reason that he was in jail in 1924, the reason that he was wanted and was extradited back to Josephine County, it was because they had found out that Milam had been the accomplice with Oregon Jones that summer. Dewey was truly innocent, but neither Dewey nor Oregon were willing to implicate their brother. Now, maybe it was out of respect, like family sort of thing, or maybe they were scared of him, I don't know. But Dewey was taken from his wife and his baby boy, sent many miles away, locked in a cage, and he didn't even do it.
That's some family love, dedication, something I would not do.
Well, I mean, then think about it on the flip side. I've been thinking about this all morning. So they paid this great respect to Milam, but what did Milam do for them? Because you'd think if he had that same respect, he'd be like, no, brother, I can't allow you to take 25 years for me, So I think that's super messed up. Just so messed up. But yeah, I think the Radcliffes and other people saw pictures or whatever they were shown, and they positively identified that Milam was the second one.
Wow.
Yeah. And then they didn't even let Dewey out. You would think that they would have been like, oh, crap. We made a mistake. All right, Dewey, you're out. But no, they didn't. Now, if we have learned anything about Ellsworth Kelley and Oregon Jones, we know that they don't like being locked up. They arrived at Oregon State Penitentiary on January 18th, 1923, and it was March 3rd, 1923, when they made their first escape attempt from OSP. That was exactly 6 weeks after they arrived. It was a Saturday, and there was a Lions minstrel show in progress there within the prison. 5 of the most, quote, desperate convicts, as they were called, had snuck saws into their cells from their jobs. So in their locations where they worked in the prison, they had access to these tools. So the prisoners involved in this were Ellsworth Kelley, Oregon and Dewey Jones, George Holtzlaw, and George Jackson. They were described as being very hardened or hard-boiled. That's what they called them. He's hard-boiled. Now, the convicts were sawing through the roof of the north cell house, and they cut all the way through the roof. They got up there and then somehow jumped down into the yard to make their way to the wall. But someone inside the prison had snitched. So the prison officials were warned just in time to catch all 5 of them in the yard. And it was handled so quickly and quietly that the people attending the minstrel show had no idea that anything had even happened.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Well, later on Wednesday, September 12th, 6.5 months after that first attempt, Ellsworth Kelley was able to escape. He and an inmate named George Jackson noticed that the guard, Joe Woolery, wasn't paying close attention to the truck that they were loading with sawdust. Ellsworth and George decided to just go for it. It wasn't planned. And they both hid themselves in a pile of sawdust in the truck. The truck was taking the load from the prison to the fairgrounds in Salem. A prison trustee saw Ellsworth while he was getting into his hiding place, and he tried to stop him, but Ellsworth pulled a knife and threatened him. George Jackson wound up getting out of the truck before it reached the fairgrounds, and he was caught actually within minutes of jumping out. Ellsworth, however, made it all the way to the fairgrounds, and he was able to slip away before the posses arrived. Guard Woolery, when he realized what had happened, he just went straight to the office of the warden, who at that time was Warden Smith, and he resigned. He said it was entirely his fault, and he didn't want the warden to be blamed, so he took the penalty, just, lost his job. And he'd only been there a few months. Now, Ellsworth was free for about 12 hours, and apparently he used that time to think over his choices, and he decided that he should probably turn himself in. He then made his way to the home owned by E.T. Hall near the Clackstar Station on the Oregon Electric. It was about 8:40 p.m. when he arrived at the house, and he asked Mr. Hall to please contact the authorities.
Huh.
Yep.
Well, there you go.
Yep. So when he was returned to the prison, he said that he was very sorry that his actions had caused the resignation of Guard Woolery, and Ellsworth also said that he had not treated the warden in the proper manner, so he was sorry. And now we have reached 1924.
Cod liver oil in sugar-coated tablets made for puny kids. Forget the nasty tasting, stomach-upsetting cod liver oil and give the thin, puny, underdeveloped children McCoy's cod liver oil compound tablets if you want to give them a good appetite and put pounds of good, healthy flesh on their bones. Doctors know all about them, and so does J.C. Perry, Central Pharmacy, DJ Fry, and all good pharmacists all over America, for they are in great demand because they are not laggards, but show results in a few days. They are not expensive either. 60 tablets, 60 cents, and children take them like candy. A very sickly child, age 9, gained 12 pounds in 7 months and is strong and healthy. One skinny woman gained 9 pounds in 24 days. McCoy's cod liver oil compound tablets, the non-laggard tablet for puny kids.
On March 28th, 1924, 6 convicts, Oregon Jones, Ellsworth Kelley, Tom Murray, William Johnson, Clive M. Weekly, and Joe George Johnson, were able to escape. It was right around 8:40 a.m. when they crawled out of a basement window, made their way across the yard, up through a tower, and then down some stairs in the tower to the other side of the prison wall. There was a highway nearby, and they encountered a vehicle driven by Charles Sperling. He was going slow enough that they were able to jump onto the running boards while he was still moving, and they commandeered the vehicle with Oregon Jones taking the wheel. They took Mr. Sperling with them, so that had to have been terrifying, and they drove a short distance east of the prison. From there, they took to the lane leading south across the fields until they got to Old Turner Road. Deputy Warden Lilly, he's not the warden at this time, but he was deputy warden, so I feel like he was like the right hand or something, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But Deputy Warden Lilly was on their trail in the prison vehicle, and the prison vehicle could move faster than the car that they were in. So he's catching up, and they could hear him coming. Oregon Jones then turned on the road that would lead them over the hill towards Shaw. They could tell that Deputy Warden Lilly was gaining on them, so after about 3/4 of a mile, they decided to abandon the car and just get off the open roads. They still had Mr. Sperling with them, and I'm not sure when they got rid of him. But, I mean, not got rid of him like killed him. They didn't kill him. They got rid of him. They took Mr. Sperling with them and headed into the brush and timber. And from there, they went southeastward, keeping low under the cover of the brush, attempting to make their way over a ridge that was directly in front of them. The initial plan was for all 6 of them to stick together and head south. So that lasted for about 15 minutes after they got into the brush, and then Deputy Warden Lilly appeared about 100 yards away and he started shooting at them. The escapee named William Johnson, he later said that the first bullet passed between his legs and the second one whizzed right by his head, like within inches. After that, he said it was every man for himself, and that was the last that he saw of the other 5. So this was between about 9:30 and 10 a.m., according to William Johnson. Johnson continued south on his own and eventually made his way to a cemetery in Turner, which was on top of a hill. And he says he laid there for a little while, just looking over the town and the country around him, but then he saw some guards, and the guards had seen him, so he scurried back to cover. He wound up in thick timber again, and he crawled under a brush pile where he stayed hidden for 4 hours. So when he came out to resume his travel, he actually wound up running right into a guard by the name of Lute Savage. And just like that, William Johnson surrendered. He said that this was in the works for a long, long time. Like this whole escape was mapped out. They'd made keys even that would open all 3 of the doors that they'd have to get through to reach that basement window. And they had a hacksaw from the prison shop, and they had sawed the bars off of the window in advance. So, I mean, they weren't already gone, but like sawed through enough that it wouldn't take a long time to do it when they were leaving. So it was Friday, March 28th, when they left, and on March 29th, 5 of them were still on the run. Posses had blocked all bridges over all the nearby rivers, and there were hundreds of people looking for the escaped convicts. Overnight, there had been a burglary at a little store in Almsville, and they knew for sure that it was the convicts because the warden had found a discarded pair of convict shoes in the store. And so here's a list of what they had taken.
2 pairs of brown coveralls, 2 or 3 pairs of blue coveralls, 2 brown hats, 2 black hats, 2 blue and 2 khaki shirts, 2 boxes of 12-gauge shotgun shells loaded with number 5 shot, half a dozen flashlight batteries, 2 flashlights, 4 pounds of cookies, 8 pounds of cheese, 15 to 20 tins of canned goods, 8 to 10 pocket knives, 4 pounds of tobacco, 6 pairs of underwear, and 5 pairs of shoes. So they think all 5 are together, despite reports that someone saw just 3 of them cross a road.
Yeah, so there were reports. I think that they actually were 3 random posse men, but a guy in Almsville saw 2 across the road, and they said, "Oh, have you seen those, the convicts? Have you seen them anywhere?" And he was like, "Oh, I think that was really them." But I don't think it was. In fact, I know that it wasn't. Anyway, that first night, the night of March 28th, it was freezing. It was freezing cold. There was lots of rain, there was sleet, and even snow. And I mean, it's March 28th.
In spring in Oregon, we have second winter.
It's true.
So.
It's weird. Like suddenly there will be in March or even April, a hailstorm, and you just wind up with like hail all over your porch. Like it's crazy. But yeah, so it was freezing cold. Now, on March 30th, 2 days after the escape, Clive Weekly was caught. He had been in Staten, Oregon, which is about 20 miles southeast of Salem. Clive explained later that he had also been separated from the others when Deputy Warden Lilly was shooting. He climbed a tree and he hid in the tree for 7 hours, and he was going it alone from that point forward. He said that he stumbled into Staten late on the night of Sunday, March 30th, and he hadn't even known that there was a town there. Like he must have just been going through thick woods, and then when he came out the other side, it was a street in Staten, and he didn't even realize it was there. So he was crossing a bridge when the town marshal saw him and told him to halt and arrested him. And then he was returned to prison around 9:00 p.m. that day. On March 31st, the home of J.A. Dorfler, located half a mile south of Marion, had been ransacked. So Mr. Dorfler and his son could see that there was a fire that had been burning up in the woods, like on this hill that was behind their house. So the two of them went to investigate, unarmed. And Mr. Dorfler started to think maybe this was a campfire and maybe, the convicts were out there camping. So he sent his son back to the house alone to go get their guns. So when the young man got back to the house, it had been completely ransacked. So this fire or whatever must have been pretty far from the house.
It was a setup.
Yeah, maybe. But yeah, it had been completely ransacked. A shotgun and a revolver were stolen, along with ammunition. The convicts had even helped themselves to food. They ate while they were there. So, they were there for a while. And then Mr. Dorfler and his son hadn't noticed at the time, but there was a heavy coat that had also been taken. Now, it was April 1st when 27-year-old Ellsworth Kelley and 20-year-old Joe Jackson were caught by Lute Savage, the same guy who caught the first one, and another guard by the name of Norman Myers. They were in the small town of Turner, right in front of Bones' garage, and it was 3:00 a.m. Jackson later said that it had been all four of the remaining convicts who had burglarized the Dorfler home, and Jackson himself actually had that heavy coat on. So Jackson said he and Ellsworth, and then Tom Murray and Oregon Jones, they had still all been together on March 31st, but since then they had parted ways. When Jackson and Ellsworth were caught, Ellsworth had just hidden the stolen shotgun underneath an old building in Turner. Both Ellsworth and Jackson took their capture, in a good manner nature. They got back to the prison around 4:30 a.m., and they wouldn't say anything about the whereabouts of Oregon Jones or Tom Murray. They were both very glad to be back, though. They actually were like, can we get back to the prison as soon as possible, please? Let's hurry this up. They looked very haggard and worn. They were uncouth, it said. They were very tired. Their hair was matted, and their eyes were glassy. The paper said that Ellsworth Kelley and Joe Jackson are among the most dangerous men to have ever escaped, which I think is crazy because I haven't seen too much of Ellsworth being super dangerous. He did help beat up that jailer, when they escaped, but I don't know. Anyway, so Jackson admitted that all four of them were the ones who had robbed the Almsville store, and while he talked about his time on the outside, while he was on the run, he was smoking a cigarette, and he was working hard to suppress a smile.
Classic.
He said that they did get some sleep when they were out there, but only in the daytime so that they could travel at night. They had tried to steal a car at one point, but they were scared off by some dogs. And they slept in a barn, and they buried themselves deeply in some hay. At one point, there were two guards who actually showed up at the barn and were searching for them. And they actually wound up walking right over the escaped convicts in the hay and didn't even realize it. So there they were.
Like they stepped on them?
I don't know, just that they walked over them. So I don't know. We used to build hay houses in my grandpa's barn. Like the hay bales, we would it was like Legos on a giant scale. And so it kind of made me wonder, was it something like that where they were walking up above on hay bales and somehow they were down below? I really don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah, I really don't know. All right, so for food, he said that they sucked eggs and they drank milk that they got from a cow that was in the barn where they were hiding. Now, sucking eggs, we have heard this before. This is when we covered the Edmund Crefeld cult. And one of the dogs that went into the bonfire had to go because he'd been sucking eggs. And basically that meant they broke the shell a little and sucked out what was inside. So I didn't know that people did that, but apparently they did.
That sounds disgusting.
It does sound disgusting, but I guess if you're desperate.
Ugh. Well, anyways, that's 4 down and 2 to go.
Yep, they've got 4 of them now. The only ones on the run still are Tom Murray and Oregon Jones. So when talking about Tom Murray, they said that he was an experienced woodsman and mountaineer, and they said that he was the shrewdest and most dangerous of all 6. So it was the night of April 2nd, just 5 days after the escape, when Tom Murray and Oregon Jones were caught near Jefferson. There were 2 militiamen, M.J. Melcher and O. Olson. They were members of the Salem National Guard. They decided to play a little trick to see if they could catch them. The men were driving their automobile along the road leading west out of Jefferson, and they stopped about 3 miles from town. Now, then they turned off all of the lights on the car, and they just sat and waited in the dark. Within a few minutes, Tom Murray and Oregon Jones crawled out of their hiding place. They had earlier scrambled to hide when cars were passing, and now that they couldn't see this automobile, they thought it was safe to come out. They started walking toward Jefferson and thus toward the direction of their car. The guardsmen yelled for them to halt, and both Murray and Jones turned around and ran. So they started shooting at them. None of them hit them, but Tom Murray stopped running and he put his hands up. Oregon Jones was able to crawl through a fence and he escaped in the brush. But they didn't catch Oregon Jones, not for a very long time. He was the last one who was on the run, and he disappeared. He roamed around the United States. He actually met a gal in Cleveland, Ohio, and they got married and conceived a baby. But I don't know if the baby was born before he was caught or not. But yeah, they were having a baby. So by April 2nd, 5 of the 6 are back home in the prison. And, they aren't keen on staying locked up.
We know at this point.
Yep. So on June 19th, just 2 months and 2 weeks after the 5th of them was returned to prison, all 5 attempted to escape again. This time they tried to tunnel out. There were 15 total prisoners in this attempt, so it wasn't just the 5 of them. And, of course, they were caught. Those 15 had a lot of restrictions put on them, and so the next day, Friday, June 20th, the rest of the prisoners staged a demonstration. That's how they explained it. They were rattling their cell doors, they were yelling, they were throwing tobacco cans through glass windows, and the prison was just chaos and noise until after midnight that night. 8 of the ringleaders for this demonstration were thrown into the bullpen, which is what they called solitary confinement. Tom Murray, Clive Weekly, Joe Jackson, and Ellsworth Kelley were among those who were put in the bullpen. And so those 4, they were the ones who had escaped previously. Later, on August 24th, just 2 months and 5 days after the tunneling attempt, Tom Murray and a convict named Eugene Kidder were able to escape. By this time, it had been realized that Tom Murray was the ringleader of the tunneling attempt and that big escape in March.
There's a lot more escape attempts than I realized.
Oh.
Just in general.
Yeah, no, it was crazy. They were escaping all the time. And I mean, it's wild, that they didn't know you shouldn't allow them to have these tools. You shouldn't, don't let them have saws. It was just, it was wild. But yeah, this time they dove into the water-filled power flume, and I don't know really what that was, but it was water, and it flows through the prison yard. So they made their way either underwater or under the cover of the high bank. So this is what the newspaper said. They had saws with them, and they sawed through 2 sets of iron bars where the flume emerged from under a wall. So then they were out. They got out. They made their way south along the water until they came upon a group of boys who were swimming, and it was right where the county road crosses the stream. The boys asked them, "Are you guys coming in?" And they said, quote, "No, just getting out." So they had jokes. But anyway, so it was between 3:15 and 4:30 in the afternoon when that happened. And fun fact, it was reported that this escape was the 25th escape to happen within the preceding 5 months.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, they did not have a good handle on, on keeping people in prison. Tom Murray was captured in Butte, Montana on Sunday, September 7th, 1924. He had been free for 14 days. They were not able to capture Eugene Kidder, however. He actually was never returned to Oregon, but there were rumors about a year later that he was serving time in a Montana prison. And so now we've got Tom Murray back in prison where he belonged.
So here's a little bit about our pal Tom. Thomas O. Murray was born on February 2nd of 1903, which made him just 21 years old when he was captured in Montana. According to Tom Murray's father, Tom had initially been a sweet, well-rounded, bright child who loved school. I feel like they always say that.
Mm-hmm.
But when he was 13 years old, Tom and one of his friends were standing on either side of a tree, and they were both throwing rocks at a squirrel up in a branch, as you do. One of the rocks, thrown by Tom's friend, hit him in the forehead and gave him a nasty gash. He had a scar the rest of his life, and his personality seemed to change after that. He lost interest in school, he lost interest in listening to his parents, and he ran away at age 14. That sounds like a normal teenager. But what do I know?
Well, they were trying to save his life when they were sharing this story.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
His father said that the wartime stress was partly to blame. Tom got a job at the shipyards during this time and started making a lot of money, which got him tied in with some pretty bad company. It was all downhill from there. The family lived on Bainbridge Island in Washington, and the first they ever heard of Tom Murray being in serious legal trouble was when he was arrested for a violent bank robbery in Florence, Oregon in 1923. It was this bank robbery that earned him 2 10-year prison sentences to be served consecutively. Tom had been just 19 when he committed the crime, and the thought of spending 20 years in prison seemed like forever.
And I can see that. At 19, the world is only 19 years long. Right? So it would be really hard to imagine 20 years.
Yeah. So did they ever catch Oregon Jones?
Yes, actually. It was in April of 1925 when Oregon Jones was arrested in Sacramento for petty larceny. He was serving a 30-day sentence when someone recognized him as Bert Oregon Jones, the fugitive from Oregon. He had been out for about a year on the run. And like I said earlier, he had traveled all over. He got married in Cleveland, had a baby. I have no idea why he was in Sacramento if his wife was in Cleveland, Ohio. But also, I think he may have still been married to Audra Lee Jones. And he probably married the new wife under a fake name because he's not going to go by Oregon Jones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
he's now Ohio Jones.
Yeah. So anyway, now the fact that he was located, it made the news on April 14th of 1925. Deputy Warden Lilly left Oregon to go down there to pick him up on April 17th. And by April 24th, he was back home, reunited with all his old pals and his brother Dewey at the Oregon State Penitentiary. When he arrived, he was wearing an Oregon boot on one ankle, a chain hobble on both ankles, and he was cuffed to Deputy Warden Lilly.
I sure hope this was named after him.
It wasn't.
But despite the name, the Oregon boot isn't a boot at all. It was an adaptation of the old-fashioned ball and chain. It was a heavy steel cuff that fit over the shoe with a 25-pound collar sitting above the ankle. So it kind of was a boot.
Kind of. You'll have to see pictures. I mean, it wasn't like a shoe. It just had like a metal thing that went underneath the shoe. So you put your foot in it, and then it locked around the ankle.
Interesting. The heaviest one used at the Oregon State Penitentiary was 28 pounds. It allowed prisoners to walk slowly, but running or moving quickly could cause the leg to break. There were 3 holes in the heel of the brace. These holes were used to bolt the prisoner to the floor of a train or an automobile, keeping them from moving away from that spot at all. The Oregon boot was invented in Salem, Oregon, and used on desperate criminals who may try to escape. An article about the Oregon boot from 1922 says, "If a prisoner is not desperate when it is locked on one of his legs, it soon will make him so."
Yep. Yeah. So, fun fact. I had mentioned that their brother Milam had escaped from the Josephine County Jail in 1924. Well, it was just a few days after Oregon Jones and the other 5 had escaped. So at the time, it was assumed that Oregon Jones had somehow got word to Milam in jail, and then the 2 of them met up somewhere, but that was never, ever confirmed. But anyway, just a fun fact. Now, when he was talking about his escape that night when Tom Murray was caught, he said that Tom Murray had gotten stuck in some wire, like on a wire fence. And so that's why he stopped and put his hands up. But Oregon Jones ran down the road and eventually climbed over the fence, and he hid in the brush all night. The next morning, he built himself a raft with railroad ties and an old gate, and he made his way across the Santiam River. Well, the raft broke halfway across, so he had to swim the rest of the way. He made his way to Albany, Oregon, where he stole a Cadillac coach car, and he drove south. When he was 3 miles out of Albany, he saw a red lantern, like someone with a light, that was signaling for him to stop. And he thought, oh no, this might be a posse. So he ditched the car and ran. And then later he saw that the posse, they were shooting at the car. So he knew that it was right. It was a posse, and that was a close call. He then backtracked toward Albany, but when he saw a freight train just south of Albany, I'm guessing probably in tangent, he hopped on and he rode the train to Eugene. He then caught a different train that took him to Merlin. And he said he traveled later to Maine, Florida, even Cuba. He was all over the place. And then, he claims that he married a woman named Helen Hensby on August 7th, 1924 in Cleveland. And he worked as a truck driver when he was there. So, yeah. Now, he eventually went back to California. I don't know why, but he stole a car. He drove it to Roseburg, Oregon on April 2nd of 1925. Then he went back to Sacramento and was selling parts off of that car that he had stolen. And that is when he was caught and arrested. So he was 2 weeks into his 30-day sentence for that when he was identified as Burt Oregon Jones. He'd had a very close call, though, of getting caught sooner. In Cleveland, apparently, he had been arrested for stealing a diamond along with $340. The arresting officer recognized him as Oregon Jones. So Oregon talked him into just taking the diamond and the $340 for himself in exchange for not turning in Oregon Jones, and apparently that worked out. I don't know why the cop didn't take it and turn him in, but, whatever. I guess he was a man of his word.
Somewhat.
And so there was Oregon Jones back in the Oregon State Penitentiary once again, back with his brother Dewey, his friend Ellsworth Kelley, who he'd known since he was a very young adolescent, and back with Tom Murray, the guy he was traveling with when he'd gotten away a year before. But as you know, these inmates didn't like to be caged. See, things at Oregon State Penitentiary were pretty awful. Prisoners would be put in the bullpen for barely any reason. They didn't even have to have a reason. They just put them in there. And they would only be allowed to eat bread and water 1 time a day.
1 time a day?
Yep, once a day.
Hopefully they're not stuffing them into orifices.
Ooh, Isabella. Yep. So yeah, they had bread and water just once a day. And there was a guard who oversaw the bullpen. And just for fun, he would randomly shoot his gun at the prisoners in their cells.
So he would just kill them?
No, he'd just shoot to scare them. Like want to see them dance or whatever, shoot at their feet. So yeah, he liked to see them squirm. He liked to watch them panic. He liked to watch them be helpless victims. And yeah, even out in the yard, apparently, guards would just randomly shoot at prisoners down there just to scare them, just to terrorize them, honestly. And yeah, the place also was very unsanitary. And I mean, just like today, healthcare was not a top priority. So if you think our prisons today are dangerous, you're right, but they're actually a vast improvement over what they once were. It's understandable that so many inmates were so desperate to get out, and thus, another plan was in the works. The biggest, most terrible scenario possible was about to unfold. And that's where we'll end the story for now, because what comes next is its own story all by itself.
Gasp.
I just got goosebumps. I gave myself goosebumps.
So, shout out to newspapers.com, Family Search, Ancestry, Pixabay, My Brother Christian, Oregon Digital Newspaper Program, and the archive at the U of O, the Forgotten Oregon Facebook group, Don Visson. Follow our social medias. We're most active on Facebook. Thank you, Monica. Forgotten Felonies. Send us an email to forgottenfelonies@gmail.com. You can send us a request for an episode.
Yep, this one was actually an offer. We just saw it, and I said, hey, I'll do the story next if you want. And so...
You risked getting banned from the Facebook group.
Well, I didn't tell them what the podcast was called. And when someone asked, I was like, I don't know if that would go against the rules, so I'll just send you a message. But, yeah. Did you see, today someone posted in there a picture of a really old building from Condon? Oregon.
Mm-mm.
And that's where, John Lynn had lived and Claude Branton worked there. And so I posted and I said something about that. So hopefully I don't get banned.
We can hope.
Yeah. So anyway, this was cool. This is a wild tale. And what's coming next is like so crazy. So crazy.
I'm ready. I hope John is.
Yep. How fun. Okay.